Καλημέρα σε όλους. Ευχόμαστε να είστε όλοι καλά και σας ευχαριστούμε πολύ που συμμετέχετε στο διαδικτυακό σεμινάριο της Ένωσης των Εταιριών Ελλάδος, μια πρωτοβουλία της Επιτροπής Περιουσίας. Το σεμινάριο αυτό θα γίνει στα αγγλικά, οπότε τώρα θα γυρίσω και εγώ στα αγγλικά και θα συνεχίσουμε έτσι. So, good morning to all attendees of this webinar organized by the Hellenic Insurance Association under the initiative of the Property Committee. We hope you're all safe and we are delighted to have you on the line. For the next hour or so, we will be debating a very interesting topic which touches upon our insurance industry as we are, as you know, all concerned with the large cat risks facing the world. So we will be discussing about whether it is possible to tackle at the same time the recovery of COVID-19 and climate change, which is there. So, you know, we've been talking about the large and emerging NatCat risks in the recent past. I remind you that late last year, we held a one-day conference where we had the opportunity to listen to scientists about climate change, other NatCat risk facing our country, like earthquake, as you know, as well as the solutions that the insurance industry can bring to preventing and financing those large risks. So today we are faced with a very rare combination, which is to recover from COVID-19 economically, and also to face and continue combating climate change. A number of very interesting questions arise, questions that highlight both risks, but also, as we will see, opportunities. We know that pandemics and climate change are both major global challenges which affect both our lives and our economies. But do we have the luxury really to deal with one of the two and let the other one? Can we afford not to address climate change because we are actually fighting COVID-19? Whilst the world is focusing on fighting COVID-19 and rebooting the economy in a fast track, climate change has not stopped. So what risk the planet would pose the recovery from COVID-19 if we ignore the Paris Agreement goals, for example? Both COVID-19 and climate change result in fundamental changes in the way we live, we work, we consume. The way we do business will change in the coming months and years. So what lessons can be learned from the lockdown experience? How can the way we work and live during this lockdown periods has impacted the planet? What has happened with emissions? How everything has changed around climate change as well? And we all know that the insurance industry is willing to play a key role in addressing future pandemics as well as climate change action. However, when it comes to pandemics, we know that it's globally recognized that they are perhaps not insurable events because, as we all know, they strike everyone at the same time all over the globe. And this makes the insurance model that we know, that of mutualization of risk, not working. On top of that, there is no clear and predictable time limit. So we do not have the possibility to calculate the risk and the premium that it will require. So what is the role of private insurance in financing such catastrophes? For pandemics, public-private partnerships seem to be the way that we should be financing those risks. So what can we really say about PPP schemes to finance large cat risks? So all these are questions that we will try and answer, and we have the great pleasure to have with us speakers who know this subject and have kindly accepted to address the webinar audience today. So I will present you, we have with us Maura Feddersen, who is Behavioral Research Consultant at Swiss Re. Good morning, Maura. We have Thilo Hermannsdörfer, who is the Market Head of P&C for Greece, Cyprus, Malta, Turkey at Swiss Re. Hi, Thilo.
Good morning.
And we have Andreas Forsberg, who is the Senior Underwriter, Central, Eastern, and Southern Europe at Munich Re. Hello, Andy.
Good morning to all of you.
Good. So I will now give the floor, the mic, to Andy, who will do his first presentation. After which we will have the presentations by Thilo and Maura, and hope we will have some time for questions at the end. So Andy, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Henry. Yasas, kalimerasas to all of you, and thanks to the Hellenic Association of Insurance Companies for being able to share our view on the subject of COVID-19 and climate change. To me, this is the first webinar, and usually I see people, so I can see when you fell asleep. So bear with me and be a bit patient, because I can't stop my presentation when you run out of patience. Current challenges is tackling both COVID-19 and recovery of the climate change possible? Yes, it is. Thank you very much for your attention. Well, actually, let's have a more serious view now. And with your kind permission, I would like to get your view on the subject by voting online. Do you think that tackling both COVID-19 recovery and climate change is possible? Please share your view. You see two options on the screen. Please put yes or no. So the results should come in every minute, I suppose, every second, ideally. So see, we have 28 people on the live poll yet. So please be brave and share your opinion so that we can see the outcome of this very basic question. Okay, I think we can give it a stop. We have 39 opinions here. If the results can be shared with us, that would just be great if this technically works. As I said, I have no clue, but this should keep you alive at least, or awake. So if I see this correctly, the majority of you says yes. I only can see this slightly, which is good news, and we will see whether this is right or wrong. Probably there is no distinct right or wrong, but we will see how things move. What are the risks and what are the opportunities from the current crisis? There is a risk that focusing on the recovery of the economy will reduce the efforts to protect the climate, maybe. Let's have a look at the current worldwide economic situation and the expected outlook first. This is a research done by our Munich Re Economical Research Department. The information is dated 25th of May 2020. And according to our Munich Re economists, we had a decent start into the year 2020. As COVID-19 developed, the situation got worse and worse at an unprecedented speed. Instead of an increase in GDP, a drop of 4.6% worldwide is expected for 2020. Leading indicators have gone into freefall. The aggregate composite purchasing manager index, which was pretty stable for the last 5 years, came down substantially for all economies. And even for the most advanced economies, it is down around 50%. Unemployment rates increased significantly, partly exceeding levels of the financial crisis, particularly in the US. The economic policy is doing whatever it takes to secure a speedy recovery. Whether this will happen, we're going to touch. The G20, which are 19 countries plus the EU countries, is taking tremendous efforts by putting money into their systems, trying to boost the economy. What is currently discussed are various scenarios, various recovery scenarios. There is a V-type scenario, a U-type, and an L-type scenario. What is a V-type scenario? A V-type scenario is a very short but strong-lived recession, something we've seen, particularly if we look into the stock markets. There was a massive drop with a speed that was never occurred before. At the same time, again, if we look into the stock market, recovery was done rapidly as never before. As it currently looks, where we see some kind of recovery, at least in certain industry, it is likely that we face a V-type scenario, however, only in some territories, whilst some other territories will face more severe effects. Even if we have this V-type scenario, we will observe significant reduction in GDP in 2020. So 4.6 is even under a V-type scenario expected, which is worse than under the financial crisis back in 2009, where there was a drop in GDP of only -2%. The more severe the scenarios get, the worse it gets. Good news, however, according at least to our economists, is that recovery will take place in 2021 and in 2022, even in a worst case scenario. Without going into detail, what can be observed is that we anticipate a more severe effect in the Eurozone compared to the US. China could even show some growth for 2020 in a V-shaped scenario, particularly if they're able to keep the production at a reasonable level. Let's have a quick look into Greece, how Corona impacted Greece. This is an analysis done by Oxford Economics. So the baseline, which is a V-type scenario, similar to that one for 2020 for Greece, expects a reduction in Greece GDP of -7.2%. The more severe the scenarios get, so if we have a second wave, that gets even worse. The good news is almost all scenarios, apart from the case where we have a second wave of pandemics coming after the lockdown, there will be a recovery in 2021, 22 and 23. The pre-crisis outlook for Greece was pretty promising. However, the recovery will take place. The pre-crisis growth, as we see here, is not expected to be continued. So there was a strong path moving up, which in no way will be taken up again. From what we've just seen on a macroeconomic basis, there is a risk that huge efforts are taken to restart the economy and putting environmental aspects at a lower priority. So getting back to our initial question, is the need to restart the economy fast, ignoring the Green Deal? Let's move from the economic view to climate implications. What can be observed in the long run is an increasing impact from natural catastrophes. This is a survey of Munich Re done on an annual basis, our Munich Re NatCat service, and this displays the last 40 years. The events counted include at least one fatality produced and losses depending on the assignment group by the World Bank of losses either greater 100 or 300,000 or 1 million or 3 million. What can be observed is that we faced during this 40 years period economical losses on an index basis of 5.2 trillion US dollars. And even the insured losses amounted to about 1.5 trillion US dollars. As you can see, the majority of both insured and uninsured losses are meteorological losses, which in the widest sense are all types of storm-related events. If we have a look into Greece, same period, 40 years, Greece faced, again on an index basis, uninsured or overall losses of 23.2 billion and insured losses of 420 million. The majority of losses, which actually is not a very strong surprise, is geophysical losses. And the second part is the hydrological events. Something that is very likely contributing to the increasing number of catastrophes, if you exclude the geophysical events, is the increase in temperatures around the world. We observe a clear trend in increasing temperatures. The average temperature on water and land in 2019, so last year, was almost 1 degree above the average of the 20th century. 2019 also was the second warmest year since temperatures were recorded back in 1880. And 9 out of the 10 warmest years were recorded only since 2005. The increase in temperatures can best and sadly be observed in the mountains. Here are some examples of glaciers in Austria. Until 2030, the volume of the ice of the area will reduce to half of the average during the period 1985-2004. And it doesn't even matter what kind of increased scenario of temperature you choose. The best case scenario is that there will be a stabilization of only 20% of the current volume by the end of the century. And the worst case scenario, the glaciers will entirely disappear by the end of the century. Consequently, there is high time for action and hopefully no excuse to defer any action despite presumably other priorities. Which actions have been taken already? In fact, there are 2 major initiatives set to tackle climate change. One is the European Green Deal, and the second is the Paris Agreement. The Green Deal is a set of policy initiatives by the EU Commission aiming to be the first continent to be climate neutral by 2050. There is an intermediary goal by 2030, which should reduce the greenhouse gas emissions by roughly 50% compared to the level of 1990. So far, we achieved a level of 23% by the year 2018. The second initiative is the Paris Agreement. Why is the Paris Agreement important? There are various scenarios regarding temperature increase by the end of the 21st century relative to the pre-industrial period. That is the period 1850 to 1900. There is a moderate scenario, which expects probably less than 2 degrees increase in temperature. There is an intermediary scenario, which expects more than 2 degrees, and the most severe expects probably even more than 4 degrees centigrade. The goal of the Paris Agreement is to keep global temperature increase to well below 2% and to pursue efforts to keep it to 1.5%. National long-term strategies must be determined on how they plan to achieve a reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. All parts of the society, from economic sectors, will play a role, from power sectors to industry, mobility, buildings, agricultural, and forestry. In a nutshell, the increase in efficiency and renewable energy and reduction of fossil extractions of fossil power is what is needed. To achieve the temperature goal, a huge amount of money is needed. And the question is if that will still be made available in times of different priorities. Again, I would like to get your opinion of what amount is needed to achieve the goal of 1.5% for Europe, not percent, the goal of 1.5 degrees. So which amount do you think an annual amount of roughly 100 billion is needed? An amount between 200 and even 250 billion per year is needed, or even more? an amount exceeding 250 billion. So please make your choice and guess which amount is needed. So I just need to cheat here a little bit because I have a second screen to see the live meeting, which we can't see here in our presenters mode. And I think it's just gone, but what I saw, and maybe you could help me with that. I think the majority voted for 200, in excess of 250 million, if I'm not mistaken, from what I see. To achieve the climate goal of 1.5 degrees, an annual amount of even up to 260 billion euro in the EU is needed to achieve the 1.5 degree goal. And that is 1.5% of the GDP of the year 2018. The good news is the EU Commission will mobilize 1 billion euros until the year 2030. Ursula von der Leyen recently said it's Europe's man on the moon moment. But still, on a standalone basis, this is probably not enough to achieve the 1.5 degree goal. Consequently, some action taken by governments and other entities is necessary. I think there is a far-reaching consensus that economical costs of the climate change exceed investment requirements to reduce negative implications by far. If a stringent, unique, all-embracing carbon dioxide price with reliable reduction path existed, no such initiative like the Green Deal was needed, which actually would have been the first best solution. The intermediary goal to reduce greenhouse gas emission by 2030 was recently reaffirmed and supported by Angela Merkel. Let me be clear, she said, there will be a difficult debate about the allocation of funds. But it is important that recovery plans always keep an eye on the climate, and we must not sideline climate, but invest in climate technologies, Merkel said. As we now plan to slowly go back to work, Ursula von der Leyen said, and invest billions of euros to restart our economy, we should avoid falling back into old polluting habits. By using the European Green Deal as our compass, we can turn the crisis of this pandemic into an opportunity to rebuild our economies differently and make them more resilient, the Commission President said. We can make our society and our planet healthier by investing in renewable energy, by driving clean cars, by renovating our houses and making them energy efficient, by buying sustainable food, reusing materials rather than throwing them away, or producing low carbon steel. That is the essence of the European deal. An open letter signed by 198 German organizations and SMEs representing millions of employees sent to Angela Merkel supported the Green Deal. What they require is to unconditionally stick to the climate goals. A revitalization of the economy must have a strong focus of making it more resilient by now investing into infrastructure and climate protection. How is the Green Deal supported by private individuals? Despite crisis, we see a strong activity in the photovoltaic sector, People, private individuals, spend more money for environmental reasons, and part of that's that they fear inflation because of all the monetary actions taken by the governments. So there are opportunities. And what we saw is reduced emissions during lockdown, where I'd like to share some observations with you, which could hopefully impact our future behavior. This is a typical German beer garden, which we all love, which was closed down during the crisis. Dolphins in the Bosporus were seen. This is just one of several examples. They were even seen in the lagoon of Venice, where water pollution has improved. And according to social ecologists, the lockdown-related improvements we have seen from just the crisis now may be a catalyst for change, because people realize the positive effects somehow can be achieved quickly. I happened to be on the Munich airport just by accident because I passed through. I thought it might be a nice idea to go there. I was exactly the only one person on that terminal, and the impact on not having pollution from airplanes is what we see currently. Another example is the traffic on a German motorway, which is usually very packed. And an example from our industry, which is the future broking at Lloyd's. Lloyd's CEO John Neal expects a change in broking methods. So what he expects is a mixture of face-to-face and virtual meetings, preventing brokers necessarily to come into Lloyd's at their boxes to do the business. What we all observed is different working concepts. Corona led to gigantic office experiments around the world. Not everyone liked it. The Germans, according to a recent study, only 1/3 would like to continue working from home in future, whilst the Australians would do it more than 50%. Principally, there is, however, an interest, and we also the benefits apart from some constraints, however, particularly if you have smaller children or other obligations to fulfill. So what we see is shorter commutes, less traffic, and ideally less emissions. However, I have to say, what is the impact of the current crisis on global carbon dioxide emissions? What we saw is a temporary reduction of CO2. The CO2 concentration within the atmosphere currently is around 410 parts per million. This is counted per liter. If we have business as usual, so there would be an annual increase of 2 to 3 parts per million. The problem is the existing CO2 level is active in the atmosphere for about 100 years. So unfortunately, there's only or hardly any short-term effect. What is the outlook? Going back to Henry's initial statement that pandemics and climate change are both major global challenges, I think it is important now to prioritize on the economical recovery, partly for the ones that suffered most. Mid and long term, and ideally now, we should not sacrifice, however, our climate goals and try to retain positive habits learned during the crisis and try to contribute ourselves as much as we can. I would like to finish my presentation with a story I came across recently that touched me a lot, and I believe has a positive impact on our own behavior, influence things in a positive way. There was a discussion between a vegetarian and a meat eater. The vegetarian asked the meat eater, if the survival of the planet relies just on your meat consumption, are you willing to reduce it? You could still eat 1 time a week your meat. As I'm not eating meat, you could even eat it twice a week. The response from the meat eater was, no, sorry, there is no way. I'm unable to cope with that. The astonishing thing is, if you compare this with the restrictions we are all faced during the corona crisis, where there was an imminent chance of getting corona next week from your neighbors, we were all able to abstain from beloved habits. No one of us was flying. No one of us was using their usual stuff. But if it is obvious that the poles are melting, which is not happening in our front garden, we are suppressing this fact. Corona taught us how to behave, and hopefully this will change our mind regarding our future behavior as well. Maura from Swiss Re will give you more insights on how our behavior might impact the climate in future. So what is the outlook? It's not showing up, but I tell you, everything is going to be fine in the end. If it's not fine, it's not the end. This is a quote by Oscar Wilde, and thank you very much for listening. Ευχαριστώ πάρα πολύ, and back to Henry.
Thanks, Andy, for your very interesting presentation about the massive economic depression we are going through, global warming still being there, how things do change when we go into lockdown, what are the massive investments required. So all these were very, very useful. I will now pass the floor to Thilo and Mara, who will continue with their presentations before we can have some question and answers afterwards. So Thilo, I'm passing on to you.
Thank you very much, Rikos, for this introduction, and good morning, everybody. And also a cordial thanks to the Insurance Association for giving us the honor to contribute to this event. It's highly appreciated. In our part, we are going to tackle the topic from maybe a slightly unusual perspective. That is the behavior. Andreas has already touched upon it. So we believe that there's clear evidence that there is a big influence that our behavior change will have. So we ask two things. How have we changed our behavior as a reaction to the COVID crisis? But also the other way around. If we change our behavior, what are the effects on climate change? So the very positive message that we learned out of this crisis situation is that, yes, we can make a difference in climate change if we commit to a change in our behavior. Before I hand over to my colleague Maura Feddersen from the Behavioral Research Unit, let me start with a little personal story. The next slide, please, Maura.
Just a quick remark from my side, if that can be heard. I can't see your presentation on the association screen, so maybe you could check this. I still see my one. I might be wrong. Sorry if I'm wrong. That's fine. I just wanted to give you that hint.
Thank you, Andreas. Can the organizers please confirm that the presentation is visible?
Yeah, that would be great because I still see my one. Panagiotis or anyone, maybe you could just confirm to Thilo that he is seeing his presentation.
We see, yes, it's visible. Okay, thank you
Perfect.
very much. Good. So this photograph that you see was taken on the 11th of March. And this is, so we were out with our team serving your region, enjoying a ski day. On that day, this was still possible, 11th of March. But it turned out to be the very last day that we have been together as a group since then. So this is already since more than 3 months by now. You can see that we were still a bit smilingly complying with the new distance recommendations. 2 days later, the Swiss Re offices were closed, and we realized, okay, this is going to get really serious now. By the way, this photo has also a very direct relation to climate change. The altitude of this ski area is just about 1,500 meters. And due to rising temperatures, the winter season there is seriously endangered, with potential consequences for a lot of people working there and the tourism in the region. And also they had to shut down 3 days later. So it's really hard for people to cope with the situation. Next slide, Maura, please. So this was a start of a period of what I would call the biggest change of collective behavior seen in many decades. After some weeks of working from home, our group chief investment officer, Guido Führer, had the idea of sending to all employees in Zurich a nice little box with some chocolate, goodies and cakes in it, together with a heartwarming letter as a sign of appreciation. So people were touched. One of our teammates, Gianluca Olciati, made a LinkedIn post that you see on the right-hand side of the slide. And look at the number of views, more than 10,000. So this crisis has definitely had an impact on our behavior. Would you have imagined before that it would be possible to switch a whole company to working from home within just a few days? Would you have imagined that it is possible for all the people to somehow rearrange their daily life, juggling between kids and homeschooling, sitting in front of a laptop for business meetings, while you couldn't go out anymore to do your shoppings or take personal time for yourself? Yeah, we have seen it was all possible. We just did it. And I mean, this is a great and strong evidence that a sustainable change of our culture, of our values and our behavior is indeed possible, and it was happening. So it's also realistic to assume that this could help fight climate change. With this, I'm pleased to hand over to my colleague, Maura. Maura, please.
Thank you very much, Thilo. Hello, everyone. And thank you very much for this opportunity to speak to you today. Did you know that scientists have given us not one, but 2 warnings on climate change already? 25 years ago already, the Union of Concerned Scientists and more than 1,700 independent scientists, including the majority of living Nobel laureates in the sciences, penned the 1992 World Scientists' Warning to Humanity. These scientists called on humankind to curtail environmental destruction and cautioned that a change in our stewardship of the earth is required if we are to avoid vast human misery. 2 years ago, on the 25th anniversary of their call, 15,000 scientists came together to give us a second notice. Since 1992, with the exception of stabilizing the stratospheric ozone layer, we have failed to make sufficient progress in solving identified environmental challenges, and most are getting far worse. And this is what you can see here in all of these graphs. It's especially troubling that we expect to see catastrophic climate change due to rising greenhouse gases from burning fossil fuels, the pace of deforestation, and the rise of farming ruminants for meat consumption. Moreover, we have unleashed a mass extinction event, the 6th in roughly 540 million years, where many current forms of life could be committed to extinction by the end of the century. Of course, what we are also seeing are many natural catastrophes which demonstrate the forceful financial impact that climate change-related risks can have on the insurance industry too. Swiss Re estimates that worldwide losses due to natural catastrophes last year were equivalent to the size of the Australian economy, $137 billion. But only 38% of these were insured. But not only is there a protection gap that the insurance industry can help to cover, but more importantly, as an insurance industry, we can uphold awareness of climate risks and serve as a partner for climate risk adaptation and the transition to a low carbon economy. And this is also what Thilo will share more thoughts on in a moment. Over the last half year, a lot has changed. COVID-19 has prompted widespread responses from governments across the world to try contain the public health consequences of this pandemic. Lockdown measures have prompted an economic contraction that dwarfs the global financial crisis of 2008 and its aftermath, as Andreas was saying earlier. We can also see the impact from the lockdown and economic contraction in global carbon output. Carbon Brief estimates a contraction of carbon output of 5.5% this year, which would be the first dip since 2008. While this reduction in carbon output sounds encouraging, we should put that early estimate in perspective. Because what you see on the right-hand side in turquoise is what scientists estimate is the pace at which we need to move to net zero CO2 emissions to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. And what you see is a radical reduction needed over the next decades, and 5.5% is just not going to do it. Plus, it's intuitive that the fall in global carbon output is linked to the economic contraction. What is not as clear, though, is as the global economy recovers, will we return to the same production and consumption patterns that generate the pre-COVID-19 level of carbon output? Or is now a good time to effect systematic changes in how our economies operate to leverage the enormous disruption of COVID-19 to help us deal with climate change more decisively? There's also a possibility that our individual behavior changes under COVID-19. For example, working from home, commuting less, traveling less could be sustained. And this is really what I'll focus on in the next few minutes. The evidence is still being collected to help us answer this question, but we've luckily got some early findings, and I've got an example here from the UK. As you know, the lockdown in the UK has been protracted. So what are some of the behavior changes that we've seen? People have noted that they work from home 64% more often under lockdown, video conference with colleagues 80% more often. Time spent with family and friends virtually is up by about 50%, and even education and exercise are done from home now. Some behaviors also occur less often. It's unsurprising that the use of private and public transport is down by 48% and 60%. This helps the climate because 20% of total CO2 emissions in the US, UK, and EU are from road transportation, and the majority thereof from private cars. Now, from a behavioral science perspective, the question is whether a new behavior, like working from home or taking the bicycle to ride to work, will be sustained, and whether we embrace a more carbon-conscious lifestyle. And this may depend on three aspects in particular. Salient, so how salient is climate change at the moment? Are we able to pay attention? Our habits. We are encountering enormous disruptions to our routines at the moment. So is it possible that our new behaviors under COVID-19 might become habits? And lastly, do our environments support our new behaviors? Do we have cycle lanes that make it easier to take the bicycle? Do governments and employers help us to get set up to work from home? So let's tackle salience first. It seems like the COVID-19 crisis has emphasized our vulnerability and shines a light on our need for preparedness. There's a lot of talk of how our focus on efficiency, just-in-time, lean methodologies, how that has made us vulnerable to disruptions. We have no slack in the system now. So the question is, can we carry over lessons on early responses to COVID-19 to help us tackle climate change? Can we apply lessons on preparedness across domains? Or is there a finite pool of worry where we have no capacity to deal with any additional threats at the moment. While it is early days, there are some indications that people still appreciate climate change at the moment. In a YouGov survey, people still view climate change as the biggest global issue, even ahead of preventing future pandemics. And this is also visible in this global Ipsos Mori survey. On a global scale, 71% of people agree or strongly agree that climate change is as serious a crisis as COVID-19. And this is good for making sure that climate change stays on the agenda. But this is not the whole story. Paying attention to climate change is made harder by the fact that as humans, we famously struggle to make sense of exponential growth. Whether we think of the rice on a chessboard story, where the rice doubled on each consecutive square and the king soon ran out of rice, or if we think of Einstein reportedly saying that compound interest is the eighth world wonder, we've always marveled at exponential growth. We tend to interpret it as something very fast growth, but we don't tend to make sense of a trend that starts slow and then escalates beyond control. Now, we've seen exponential growth in the spread of COVID-19. We may also encounter exponentiality in climate change. If we are able to think exponentially in relation to climate change based on the recent example of COVID-19, that can help us appreciate the seriousness of the situation, although as humans we have a natural tendency not to do so. Ostrich effects count against us here as well. We are hopeless optimists and we tend not to want to look the proverbial tiger in the eye, especially when the risk appears further away, the issue is complex, and our own role and impact in this is uncertain. So the ostrich effect is a phenomenon that we need to counter to emerge from COVID-19 with a better approach to climate change. In addition to whether we pay attention or not, our behaviors have forcibly changed due to lockdown. So is it possible that our new routines become habits? Habits are very powerful. A friend of mine usually goes jogging in the morning. Under COVID-19, the kids were home and he ended up jogging in the evening one day. He was greeting others on the road, saying, "Good morning." Although other joggers looked puzzled, he couldn't help himself and did this several times. Habits are great because they help us free mental bandwidth to deal with critical emerging issues. For example, if you're driving and someone walks into the road, you don't even have to think about where your brake is. But you might have an opportunity to think more tactically about whether you should try a swerve or brake. As in the case of my friend whose jogging habits were interrupted, there's another story on habit interruption that we can look at. In 2014, there was a 2-day shutdown of the London Metro. Commuters opted for cycling or used other train lines to get to work, and surprisingly, their improvisations only led to 6% more time in transit. Some people got to work even faster, like those who usually traveled on slow lines. Many commuters who discovered a faster or more enjoyable journey embraced the option to make this part of their new routine. And of course, this discontinuity is abundant in coronavirus times. Many of the cues in our environment that usually prompt our habitual responses are missing, which is stressful and tiring, but it is also an opportunity. The disruptions we're experiencing, like working from home, minimizing travel, can signify a fresh start that allows us to form new aspirations around sustainable travel, for example. What could count against this is the risk of transport distancing, as we might avoid public transport looking to use our cars even more than previously. And then lastly, what will actually stick in future? What sticks is also prompted by our environment, especially as we find that modern technology supports us in our new ways of working. We may find it easier to embrace a more carbon-conscious way of life in the long run. Similarly, cycle lanes are very important to make it easier to use the bicycle to get around, and there are a myriad of other environmental cues that can help us make those new habits sustainable. So as I round off, let's recap. We know climate change appears to be on our minds right now, and there is political pressure to integrate sustainability into the path to recovery. Plus, there is an incredible shock to our habits, and some of these we may decide to embrace. Lastly, though, our urban environments and technology need to help us to make these new behaviors sustainable. And of course, this should go hand in hand with the broader systematic changes in our economies that I mentioned at the outset. And perhaps this is where public-private partnerships could also help. So Thilo, this is where I'd like to hand back to you.
Good, thank you, Maura. If you want to switch to the next slide, please. So yes, as also Erikos mentioned already in the beginning, in the preparation for this session, we also touched upon the question of what role the insurance industry can play together with the state in order to mitigate the economic effects of such a crisis that we are in. Now, with all catastrophes of a large scale, be it either a pandemic, but also, for instance, a large natural catastrophe such as an earthquake, the public sector is faced with a significant impact on the budget. And unfortunately, this happens on both sides of the balance sheet. You have a higher cost, for example, for recovery measures on infrastructure after an earthquake, or as we can see right now, for supporting the economy in case of a pandemic. At the same time, you have a drop in income because there is less tax revenue, very relevant for Greece because of dropping tourism, but also from less production and less trade. So it's a double hit, and the state would have every interest to manage this. And it's easier to manage this if the financing gap between what is insured and what is not insured is as small as possible. So this is what we call in our insurance industry the so-called protection gap. Next slide, please, Mara. Thank you. So now there is several tools that a government can apply either before an event or after an event. And generally speaking, any tool that is applied before an event is just superior because for many reasons it's predictable and all that. And because if you are prepared, you increase the speed of recovery also after an event, which in turn helps the economy to get on their feet much quicker. So this is what we call resilience. Now, in principle, insurance is a very powerful tool in this because there's predefined conditions, there's a very professional risk management, you have an amount of money that is predefined for the coverage, and in case the contractual conditions are fulfilled, you have also a very quick and very good organized payout. It's clear who's entitled to payments. Now, in case of a pandemic, there's also a lot of challenges. First of all, pandemics are very, very costly. They are in the order of several points of GDP when they occur. And the trick is, it occurs everywhere at the same time. Every country around the world literally has the same order of impact. So this is a huge challenge. And the principle of diversification between a community of solidarity, which is the basis for all what we do in insurance, this principle doesn't work anymore because everybody is hit at the same time. Furthermore, there are also considerable uncertainties around the occurrence of such an event. And all this means that a pandemic is in principle not insurable, at least not by classic means. And it is impossible for the insurance industry to carry this risk alone. And next slide, Maura, please. So this is where, in principle, the idea of a private-public partnership comes into play, and the industry, our insurance industry, is very willing to start a dialogue of what we can do together. And there's several ways you can arrange this on various levels. So the most granular is on the basis of individuals, in other words, the insureds. But you can also have national insurance schemes. For example, you have pools for terrorism and some pools for natural catastrophe. But also you could think about a macro level as a risk transfer solution for governments, or even for a group of governments, for example, on European or even on worldwide level. For each of these, there are examples of solutions that have been successfully implemented. And yes, we are open to start the dialogue. And with this, I would like also to open the forum for discussion here.
Right. So thank you very much, Mara and Thilo, for very, very interesting presentations and your insights. I believe we have a few minutes, not more than 10, for a few questions that have been already submitted before the event. So I will perhaps go into one question for Andy, which is the following. We know, and you showed that very clearly, that the Paris Agreement goals and the Green Deal require very significant investments, and I think the attendees voted the right answer, that it is more than 250 billion per annum. And we know also that assets will remain stranded because they are not friendly to the environment. So how do you see this appetite investing in green changing with COVID-19 and the need to recover very fast? And what could we do as insurers in this respect, not to stop these necessary investments?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, Erikos. Thank you very much. I think particularly the insurance industry, and even before COVID-19, invested strongly into green energy, into infrastructure projects, and having a very strong focus on green energy. And I think particularly now, and the influence from the governments are very strong to promote big organizations who have huge money under investment, to put a strong focus to put that into green energies. And I'm pretty convinced that this will support the climate change.
Thanks, Andy. Now, there's also a question around what we heard from Maura on this very, very interesting behavioral aspect. And you showed us very great insights on how the way we've lived the last couple of months the lockdown has changed the consumption. And I think also in the presentation of Andy, there was this photograph of dolphins appearing again in the Bosporus, and he mentioned also in Venice, which hasn't happened perhaps for some years now. So how can the insurance industry help leverage and communicate those important insights that the planet reacts and we should not stop paying attention to those messages that the lockdown showed us?
Thanks, Erikos. I think that's a really interesting question. One of the things that is so challenging about the response to climate change is that climate change appears to be so far in the future. It's so complex. And as individuals, we don't necessarily know what impact we are having. It's not necessarily tangible. But under COVID-19, what we've seen is how nature is recovering very quickly. As you're saying, the dolphins in the canals of Venice, the Bosporus. It's really becoming tangible that when, as humans, we hold back, it does make a big difference. And this is what I would say here in terms of feeling the impact, in terms of feeling there's a sense of control over the situation and agency. I think those are, from a psychological point of view, some of the ways that how insurers might be able to approach talking with stakeholders, including with individuals, to show that a response is possible and it makes a difference when we try.
Great, thanks a lot, Mara. That's really a good idea, really. Then we've got a few questions, but perhaps they were answered in the presentation of Thilo on the financing, on the public-private partnerships and how they can play a role, on the differences that you mentioned between risks that are insurable, large nat-cat risks that we know, floods, hurricanes, earthquakes, are still insurable to a very, very big extent. But there are perhaps some differences you highlighted in your presentation with the pandemic. So that's one perhaps question. What are the big differences between nat-cat and a pandemic? And perhaps if you think there are data, sufficient data, to allow us one day to be able to assess more precisely the risk of a pandemic.
Yes, thank you, Erikos. Super relevant question. So let me, in terms of the differences, highlight again maybe the principle of diversification. In insurance, we work on community of solidarity. So if, for example, in fire insurance, if my house burns, fortunately or hopefully the house of my neighbor does not burn. And so together with all the other insureds, we form a community to tackle this economic loss. In terms of earthquake, there's also a community of solidarity. It's bigger. For example, if you have a big earthquake, we all don't hope it in Athens, but you know, at least in the rest of the country, there's maybe people not suffering from a loss, and even more so in Europe and worldwide, the chance is very high that there's no earthquake at the same time. So this is where this risk community can stand together and help you in this situation. Now, in the case of a pandemic, this doesn't work anymore, right? Because everybody is hit at the same time. We see worldwide incredible high number of people that are infected and have died, and every country is struggling with the economy. So there, the principle of diversification is just not working anymore, which is the basis of our insurance. So this is the first big difference. Second difference, I would say, is in the certainty in which we are able to model this. We have really very, I would say, good and sophisticated models. We have a reasonably good expectation of how often an earthquake would occur. Always an average, of course. You know, it's not deterministic; it's probabilistic. But we have a very good idea. So we know how, with an earthquake of magnitude 6 or 7, you know, how on average every house is damaged. For a pandemic, this is much more uncertain. Having said that, we make big progress on the pandemic modeling as well, but the uncertainties are just, as of today, much bigger. And next to that, the loss that you incur is also influenced by human action, right? So by what we have just discussed, individual behavior, but also of measures that the governments take in order to contain this. So all this makes the prediction of the economic impact much harder. And last but not least, the order of magnitude that is so much different. I mean, we have shown before that in a typical, let's say in a typical or bad nat cat year, we have maybe 140 or so billion economic loss, maybe 40% of that is insured. But this corresponds to, let's say, 0.15, 0.17, 0.20% of the GDP. And we are talking in a pandemic about several percentage points. So this is orders of magnitude bigger. And it is clear it's very hard to finance this.
Thank you, Thilo, so much. I think we're running a bit out of time, but we also covered extensively the topic. If you allow me perhaps to draw a few conclusions on what you have told us today before we close this webinar. So on this very important question, how to tackle both the recovery from COVID-19, not forgetting that climate change is around, we must make it possible. And I think the audience was very, very optimistic and voted 90% it is possible when Andy asked the question. And that we don't really have the choice because we also saw that it is the biggest risk according to the survey that Maura showed us. So we can't really stop the climate action and we need to find a way to deal with both of them. On the other hand, we also saw this very, very interesting insight that we have to believe and think for the future in a green perspective, and that we can make a difference, as Thilo said, and as Maura showed us so vividly with the graphs and all the information provided. And then that despite the big differences and challenges that pandemic financing present and how different it is from other NatCat risks, there is certainly room for partnership. It is a typical public and private partnership thing to do. And I know that in Europe, I would really like to thank you very much again. Thank you, Maura. Thank you, Andy. Thank you, Thilo, for being with us. And I would also like to thank all the attendees who stayed with us for a bit more than an hour, and look forward to our next webinar or our next seminar in a physical manner in due course. So thank you all and have a nice day.
Thanks to you and the
Thank you very
association.
much. Stay safe and healthy.
Thank
All the
you.
best. Bye-bye.
Absolutely.
Bye.
Take care, guys. Bye.